We spend so much of our lives admiring the people we see on the big screen. We look at a man like Clint Eastwood, and we see the embodiment of the lone hero, the rugged face that never flinches, the voice that commands silence, the legend that walks away from an explosion without ever looking back. But sometimes when you pull back the curtain, you realize that the man who plays the hero on camera and the man living in the shadows are two very different people. Today I want to talk about a chapter in his life that Hollywood doesn't put on a poster. It's a story about a clinic, a cold room, and the chilling reality of what happens when a person decides that everyone else in their life is just a character to be edited. Let's go back to that moment, to a sterile, quiet clinic far away from the glitz of the red carpet. The air in that room didn't carry the smell of care or recovery. It was thick, almost suffocating, with the sharp, metallic tang of industrial-strength disinfectant. Eastwood was sitting there on a cheap plastic chair, perfectly still. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't looking at the clock. He wasn't even staring at the door. He sat with his massive, vein-mapped hands resting flat on his knees, motionless, like a body of water that had completely frozen over. He didn't seem to be waiting for news. He seemed to be waiting for a transaction to complete. When the surgeon finally emerged, the sight was harrowing. The doctor's gloves were stained, a visceral reminder of what had just happened behind those doors. Most men would have jumped up, eyes filled with anxiety, asking if she was alive, if she was okay. But not him. Eastwood stood up with the slow, deliberate, mechanical precision of a machine coming to life. He didn't utter a single word about her health. He didn't even glance toward the recovery room where Sandra Locke was shivering in the aftershock of the trauma. Instead, his voice came out flat and devoid of any human tremor. "Is everything clean?" He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of cash. He didn't hand it over. He tossed it onto the wooden table beside the doctor. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was dry and hollow, cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. It was a purchase, nothing more. Without a second look, he turned his back on the room, on the doctor, and on the woman who had just undergone the procedure he demanded. As he walked out, the rhythmic tap of his heels against the linoleum sounded less like footsteps and more like a clock counting down. Every step was perfectly measured, perfectly, even the walk of a man who felt absolutely no weight on his conscience. The American hero we see in the films is all light and shadow, but in that clinic, Eastwood was something else entirely. He was a ghost, a presence that stripped away the humanity of the situation. To him, this wasn't a life-altering tragedy. It was a technical error, a variable in his life script that didn't fit the scene, and therefore it had to be deleted. He treated the reality of a pregnancy with the same cold detachment as a director deciding to cut a few frames from a movie reel that didn't make the final edit. If you look at the records from that time, the language is terrifyingly detached. Clinic log entry #4482 doesn't talk about a person. It speaks of a minor routine procedure. The notes state, "The patient's condition is stable following the elective extraction. The partner, Eastwood, insisted on immediate departure to avoid media presence. All records are to be filed under minor routine procedure to ensure maximum privacy." It's a masterclass in erasing evidence. They didn't just want to hide the act, they wanted to bury it in administrative jargon. Sandra Locke, in her own words, finally saw the truth of the man she had been standing beside for 13 years. She would later reflect with the quiet bitterness of someone who had been discarded like a prop. "He treated my pregnancy like a bad take in a movie. He wanted it cut, he wanted it gone, and he didn't care about the blood left on the floor." 13 years of her life, her youth, her devotion, her future, all tethered to a man who viewed her not as a partner, but as an asset to be managed. 2 procedures, countless nights of silence, and in the end, not a single word of apology. Just the cold, steady sound of his heels walking away. When you hear this, you don't need a summary of what's right or wrong. You see the pattern for what it is. You see that for some people, the most dangerous thing in the world isn't an enemy from the outside. It's being the person closest to a man who has decided that the only star in his world is himself. It makes you look at those old grainy movie posters a little differently, doesn't it? You start to see the man behind the myth in the hollow space where a heart should have been. If the clinic was where he performed the surgical removal of what he deemed a liability, the transition that followed proved that this was never an isolated moment of crisis. It was a strategic clearing of the stage. For a man who viewed the people in his life as assets, once an asset had been drained of its utility, it became nothing more than a piece of hardware nearing its expiration date. The replacement wasn't a spontaneous betrayal. It was a planned handover executed while the person he was discarding was still tethered to the physical and emotional aftermath of the procedure he had demanded. In the dressing room of the Mountain House, Eastwood stood before the full-length mirror preparing for his next public appearance. His left hand gripped the silk of his tie, his right hand smoothed the silver hair back with practiced mechanical precision. Every movement was exact, mirroring the focus he applied to any film set. He didn't look at the reflection of the room behind him. He looked only at the image he was constructing. He picked up his phone, his voice steady, flat, and entirely devoid of any tremor as he spoke to his assistant. Arrange for the car to pick up the guest at 8:00 p.m. He stepped out of this dressing room, his footsteps hitting the hardwood floor with a dry, rhythmic, and uncompromising sound. He walked straight down the hallway, passing the door to the room where Sandra Locke was recovering. She was inside, her breathing labored and shallow, yet he didn't slow his pace. He didn't turn his head. He didn't pause to offer a glass of water or a word of acknowledgement. The dry click of his dress shoes against the wood was loud enough to drown out the faint, soft moans of someone in physical distress just feet away. He reached the front door, pausing only to check the alignment of his pocket square and the crispness of his lapels. He checked the flatness of his breast pocket with a flick of his fingers, ensuring that everything about his persona was perfectly groomed for the cameras. He stepped out into the night and arrived at the premiere event, greeted by the blinding, chaotic glare of the flashbulbs. He stepped onto the carpet with a new woman on his arm, a wide, practiced smile plastered across his face. But if you look at the footage from that night, the performance falls apart under scrutiny. His mouth was curved upward, but his eyes, those famous squinting eyes, remained completely flat, cold, and unmoving. It was a smile that stopped at the skin, never reaching the muscles behind his gaze. This wasn't just a new relationship, it was an act of obsolescence. He operated on the belief that once a person was broken, weakened, or no longer served the specific script of his current life, they could be discarded like a costume that no longer fit the season. The administrative trail left behind was as clinical as his demeanor. A studio press release schedule from 1979 noted, "Mr. Eastwood to be accompanied by the guest for the premiere event." But hidden beneath the public scheduling was a private handwritten directive from Eastwood himself. Ensure Locke remained strictly confined at Mountain House during the public appearance to avoid any potential interference. He hadn't just replaced her, he had placed her under house arrest to ensure that his new scene could be performed without the intrusion of his old reality. The coldness of the logistics is hard to reconcile with the humanity of the situation. As Sandra Locke herself later wrote, reflecting on the feeling of being discarded, "He didn't just end my future, he replaced me as if I were a costume that no longer fit his current production." Another witness, someone who saw the reality of that transition from the inside, described it with a clarity that still lingers today. "It was the ultimate act of cruelty seeing him parade someone else in front of the world while my body was still healing from the procedure he demanded." He didn't look back. He didn't acknowledge the life he had left behind in the dark of that house. He simply continued to move through his world, ensuring that every frame of his public existence remained perfectly curated, while the person who had once stood by his side was left to fade away, treated as nothing more than a discontinued prop in a production he had already decided to move on from. The boardroom was where the final phase of his control took hold. It wasn't about physical presence anymore. It was about the total erasure of her professional autonomy. Eastwood walked into the room first, his movements stiff and practiced, followed by a silent entourage of accountants and lawyers, the men who made his scripts legally binding. He sat at the head of the long, polished table. Locke was seated opposite him, surrounded by these men in dark suits who didn't look at her, only at the documents in front of them. Eastwood didn't say a word as he slid a thick stack of legal papers across the mahogany surface. The pages hit the wood with a heavy final sound. He didn't ask for her cooperation. He simply leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest, and began tapping his index finger against the edge of the table. Click, click, click. The rhythm was uneven, designed to grate against the nerves. He watched her as she'd read the lines. Every time she looked up, questioning a clause or a number, he wouldn't speak. He would just shift his gaze slightly to the right toward his lead attorney. The lawyer didn't need a prompt. He would immediately begin reciting the consequences of non-compliance. His voice a drone of penalties, liquidated damages, and breach of contract clauses that would leave her bankrupt. Eastwood's expression remained fixed. He didn't blink when she gasped at the figures. He didn't move when she looked at the clause that stripped her of all future royalty claims and intellectual property rights. He just sat there, his frame occupying the largest space in the room, his eyes scanning the room to ensure every other person was aligned with his directive. When she finally pushed back, her voice shaking, he didn't raise his volume to meet hers. He leaned forward, the chair creaking under his weight, and stared at the bridge of her nose, a look that rendered her protests invisible. The documents were ruthless. They contained lines like termination of employment and associated royalty claims. All intellectual property remains with the producer. The subject acknowledges no further claim to the production entity. They effectively turned her decade of work into his sole property. He viewed the studio, the contracts, and her career as a subsidiary of his own empire, one he wasn't going to let succeed, but rather one he would bleed dry. He watched the light fade from her face as she realized that every dollar she had earned and every project she had built was being legally repossessed. He didn't stand up until the final pen stroke was dry. He tucked the signed papers into his briefcase, stood up, and adjusted his cuffs in the reflection of the glass wall. He walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving the lawyers to finalize the burial of her career. As Locke would later recount, he knew how to starve me out. He didn't just break my heart, he broke my bank account, my career, and my will to keep fighting. For him, the boardroom was just another set, and the outcome of this meeting was the final scene he had been directing for months. While the boardroom was where he systematically dismantled her professional life, the final layer of his control, the most impenetrable one, was the machine he had built to ensure that no part of the truth ever touched his public image. The same power that allowed him to strip her of her assets was the fuel for the Hollywood whitewashing engine, a system designed to protect the legend at the expense of everyone else involved. Eastwood sat in his private office at Warner Bros., the room dimly lit, the leather chairs smelling of old wealth and absolute authority. On the mahogany desk in front of him lay a damage control report, a summary of whispers and potential headlines that dared to mention the reality of what happened at Mountain House. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He took a slow, measured sip of whiskey, his eyes tracing the lines of the report with a cold, analytical focus. He reached for the desk phone, his fingers moving with a practiced, casual rhythm. The call lasted exactly 3 minutes. He didn't need to issue threats or lose his temper. He simply spoke a few words, his voice low and steady. Handle it. That was it. As soon as the receiver clicked back into its cradle, the machinery began to churn. Within hours, the internal flow of the industry shifted. Editors and PR managers, men who owed their careers to the studio's success, received their directives. Any investigative piece that risked exposing the nature of the Locke case was pulled from production. In their place, a new narrative was meticulously crafted. Overnight, the stories changed. Where there was talk of forced procedures and imprisonment, there was now talk of artistic differences and the unpredictable nature of an unstable partner. They reframed her agony as the jealousy of a woman scorned, a classic dismissive trope that effectively silenced her credibility. Eastwood stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the studio lot. A faint, thin smile touched his lips, not a smile of humor but of satisfaction. He watched the world shift around him, seeing how easily the media could be redirected, how quickly the truth could be buried under layers of glossy magazine profiles and tributes to his stoic professionalism. He knew he was untouchable because he had spent decades buying the silence of the industry with the profits of the very movies that made him a hero. The documents from that period were stark. A memo circulated to all public relations heads left no room for interpretation. Memo to all PR heads: Clint's private life is off limits. Any article mentioning the Locke case is to be pulled immediately. Prioritize the American legend narrative at all costs. It was a total embargo on the truth. When the system functions this way, the American legend isn't just a role on the screen. It becomes a protected entity, a holy relic that the entire industry is sworn to defend. If a journalist or a witness tried to throw mud at that image, the system wouldn't just ignore them, it would bury them. As one observer of the era noted, the atmosphere was thick with this unspoken rule. They treated his image like a holy relic. If you threw mud at it, the system would bury you alive before a single speck could stick. He watched as the stories faded. The public would go on seeing the cowboy the savior, the man of justice, while the realities of the Mountain House and the sterile clinic were scrubbed clean from the public record. He hadn't just won the legal battle. He had won the war for history itself, ensuring that when the world looked back at his life, they would see only the carefully curated frame he had allowed them to witness. He turned away from the window, walked back to his desk, and poured another glass of whiskey. The silence in the office absolute, reinforced by an industry that had traded its conscience for the box office return of The Man in the Mirror. While the studio PR machine was busy burying the truth behind layers of polished narratives, Eastwood took a more surgical, hands-on approach to ensuring that Sandra Locke would never work in the industry again. The whitewashing protected his legend, but the character assassination was designed to systematically destroy her. This was no longer just about financial repossession or public silence. This was about turning her own talent, her own reputation, and her very identity into a liability. Eastwood would often sit in the dimly lit corner of his study, the blue light of a monitor illuminating his face as he scrolled through the very rumors he had helped cultivate. He wasn't just observing the chaos, he was consuming it. He read the gossip, the anonymous comments, and the speculation with the same detached focus he brought to editing a film reel, finding a cold, clinical satisfaction in watching her professional reputation crumble. He didn't need to issue a formal ban. His weapon of choice was the whisper campaign. He would show up at a high-end bar or a private gathering of industry titans. His demeanor relaxed, his tone casual. He would bring up her name, but never with malice, only with a look of feigned, weary concern. He'd lean in, lower his voice, and drop a line, "She's become so difficult to work with," or, "It's tragic, really, she's suffering from such emotional instability." He would say it just once, let it hang in the air, and then change the subject. That was all it took. The seed was planted. Because it came from him, the man who owned the industry's respect, nobody dared to question it. When Locke would go to auditions, the response was always the same, a polite, cold rejection. No explanations, no feedback. She was a ghost in the casting room, an actor whose name had been tainted before she even walked through the door. Eastwood never showed his face at these auditions. He didn't have to. His influence preceded him like a shadow, clinging to her every move, turning her dream of acting into a gauntlet of closed doors. He had transformed her from a respected professional into a social pariah, a woman difficult to manage in a town that prized obedience above all else. The machinery of this destruction was documented in private guarded folders. One confidential file explicitly stated, "Subject Locke is to be blacklisted. Spread rumors of unprofessional conduct and emotional instability to ensure no major studio takes a chance on her." It was a hit list, a manual for ensuring that a person's talent became irrelevant compared to the stigma he had carefully glued to her name. He didn't need to lift a finger to physically stop her. He simply poisoned the well. He manipulated the perceptions of everyone she relied on, directors, producers, fellow actors, until she was entirely isolated. He turned the industry she loved against her, forcing them to treat her as an outcast, simply because he had whispered that she was unstable. He sat in that dark office, checking the progress of his campaign, noting the canceled contracts and the dwindling calls. He watched as the social isolation took hold, effectively cutting her off from the community that had once welcomed her. It was a slow, agonizing process. He wasn't using a gun or a physical blow. He was systematically stripping away her professional life and her social identity until she had nothing left but the silence of her own home. As Sandra Locke later described, the weight of that reality was inescapable. "He didn't need to punch me. He just told the world I was crazy, and the world, being the fool that it is, believed him." He watched the result of his labor with the same stoicism he brought to the screen. To him, the industry was a closed loop, and he was the one who controlled the gate. If he decided someone was done, they were done. He walked through his world, his silhouette sharp and unchallenged, leaving behind a trail of ruined careers and hushed whispers, perfectly content in the knowledge that he had managed the outcome with the precision of a master director. He hadn't just removed a partner. He had successfully executed a total social and professional erasure, ensuring that the only voice left in the room was his own. As the shadow cast by the systematic destruction of Sandra Locke's career grew long, the final act of this story shifted away from the boardrooms and casting calls, settling into the gilded silence of Eastwood's own estate. With the assassination of her reputation complete, the industrial machine that had protected him for decades finally faced a new, unscripted threat, the truth finally written down in black and white. In the final years, surrounded by the cold, heavy glow of golden Oscar statuettes, Eastwood sat in his private study. These trophies, meticulously polished and lined up on shelves of rare wood, were designed to reflect brilliance, but in the solitude of that room, they reflected nothing. When Locke's memoir, When God Made Mistakes, finally hit the shelves, it wasn't a sudden explosion. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confrontations. He picked up a copy, his fingers tracing the spine with a chilling, practiced indifference. He read a few pages, the very pages that detailed the cold precision of his surgical removals. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the book. He didn't burn it. He didn't throw it away. He simply slid it into the deepest drawer of his mahogany desk and turned the brass key, locking it away as if it were just another piece of unwanted studio correspondence. He continued to live in the orbit of public adoration. The crowd still cheered. The critics still lauded his rugged stoicism. But within the four walls of that mansion, the atmosphere remained as still as the clinic waiting room from years before. He understood, as any director does, that the public only sees what is on the frame. He knew that the record of his life was now bifurcated. There was the version polished for the history books, and then there was the version locked in that desk drawer, a record of human dignity traded piece by piece for box office records. He sat in the silence, often for hours, staring out at the expansive, manicured grounds of his estate. He didn't reach out to the others whose lives had been similarly compartmentalized or managed during his ascent. He didn't revisit the decisions that had systematically dismantled the lives of those closest to him. Instead, he occupied the space of a man who had won every battle he ever waged, yet remained trapped in a structure he had built entirely out of his own ego. He was in the eyes of the public the embodiment of American success, a man who had never lost. Yet in that room the silence felt heavy, a stagnant air that no amount of industry accolades could circulate. The files that had once dictated the lives of others were now just memories, but their existence remained a permanent underlying current. The memoir was more than a literary work. For those who had been close to the events, it was an autopsy, a post-mortem examination of a heart that had been sacrificed for a brand. One passage in particular seemed to haunt the professional narrative. The memoir is not just a book, it is an autopsy. It reveals that beneath the stoic hero, there was a man who traded human dignity for box office records. He eventually rose from his chair, his gait as measured and rhythmic as it had been 30 years prior, walking toward a window that overlooked his private domain. He remained the king of his own domain, a man whose word had effectively become law in an industry that had long since surrendered its moral compass to his influence. He knew that even if the public chose to ignore the contents of the locked drawer, the history was there etched into the silence of the people he had once commanded. He didn't seek redemption, nor did he seek closure. He simply accepted the reality he had sculpted a life of absolute power, absolute isolation, and a legacy built upon the rubble of those he had discarded. As the twilight deepened over the estate, the distinction between the hero and the man became entirely blurred. There was only the result of a 40-year campaign of control, a hollow victory, where the trophies stood in rows gleaming under the lights, while the truth of his life remained tucked away in the dark, silent depths of a locked drawer. As an observer once noted, he may have won the battles, but he lost the war for his humanity, and that is a price no Oscar can ever pay for. Oscar can ever pay for. Oscar can